Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. As I run from death, I would like to address 3 short articles that, unfortunately, have perpetuated and, in some senses, recently popularized the anti-war on death, pro-mortality mindset. And in particular, I want to emphasize these articles and discuss counters to them because, as I feared, they draw some of their arguments from the very flawed paper by Daniel Callahan and Sherwin B. Nuland, which I addressed thoroughly in my previous broadcast, Running from Death number 9. If you haven't heard that broadcast, I do encourage you to listen to it as well, because in this discussion, I will assume that the fallacies of Nuland and Callahan do not need to be discussed a second time. If you're interested in a detailed exposition of what I think they are, please do listen to Running from Death number 9, because I try to go in considerable depth in their New Republic paper to see exactly where I think they make flawed and mistaken and, in some cases, unethical arguments. But these authors, especially the later 2 that I will discuss, certainly draw on what Nuland and Callahan say. The first piece is by Dudley Clendinen. Dudley Clendinen wrote an article called The Good Short Life in the Sunday Review section of the New York Times. And this is the most personal of the 3 articles, because Mr. Clendinen has been diagnosed with amyloid lateral sclerosis, or ALS, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. There is currently no cure for this disease, and it's essentially a progressive deterioration of one's faculties. It doesn't end well for people who have it, and there's a lot of inconvenience, discomfort, debilitation, and suffering involved. So Mr. Clendenin essentially doesn't want to let this disease go its full course. Instead, he wishes essentially to end his life at the time at which his ALS prevents him from enjoying life in the way that he was used to enjoying it, and prevents him from having the experiences that he considers to make his life worthwhile. Now, in many ways, one can certainly empathize with a person in his situation, in the sense that he is on the precipice of losing many of the faculties that for him made life most enjoyable. And this realization is enough to drive any person to despair. Now, he doesn't really phrase his situation as one of despair, but rather he believes that facing death is, quote, one of life's most absorbing thrills and challenges. I don't agree with that. I think he's trying to build up a kind of front of courage, maybe even to persuade himself that this is a challenge that he has to confront in order to not feel that despair, which is, I think, quite understandable. At the same time, though, the way he takes that to mean is not the best way, because he's essentially saying, despite the rhetoric of courage, that he's going to give up that fight against death when it becomes too uncomfortable or, perhaps in his thinking, unbearable. However, there is a great counterexample to that attitude. That counterexample is a man for whom I have tremendous respect, even though I may sometimes disagree with him on some of the fine points of the philosophy he uses to frame some of his writings. That scope of disagreement pales in comparison to the tremendous respect I have for this individual, and his name is Stephen Hawking. He's one of the most intelligent and accomplished people today. He is, of course, a brilliant physicist, and what's most remarkable about his story is he was diagnosed with ALS at the age of 21, and he is now 69, so he has had this disease for 48 years. And in that time frame, he has created all of the accomplishments for which he is known. So this individual, having this disease that has no cure, that has progressively rendered him more and more paralyzed, so that essentially he cannot move his limbs, cannot even speak. He has to essentially use a computer program and a voice synthesizer and a device that allows him to type very slowly through the movements of his cheek in order to transmit his brilliant thoughts. And yet he has not only kept at it, but he has made remarkable contributions, not just to the field of physics, but also to popular discourse. I think in many ways Hawking's accomplishments extend beyond his strict theoretical work and go into areas like his encouragement for space exploration, or his theories about the possibility of other intelligent life forms in the universe which have very interesting ethical implications, as well as his promotion of rational atheism. Whatever I may personally think of some of his interpretations of cosmology, a great service that he has done is to continually emphasize that a religious viewpoint is not necessary to explain the universe. And while he believes that the universe had an origin in a Big Bang, and I have disputed that theory, nevertheless, he has stated time and again that that picture of the universe does not require a creator and certainly does not require a personal God. So overall, I think Hawking's influence has been tremendously positive, and his story should teach everybody that no matter what his or her physical state, no matter what the prognosis is, one can still accomplish great things. Stephen Hawking was originally given 2 to 3 years to live at the time of his diagnosis, and he even originally despaired to the point where he wasn't sure whether he would pursue his PhD, and of course for a theoretical physicist that kind of degree is a necessity, but he did eventually persevere. I encourage everyone to at least read the Wikipedia entry on Stephen Hawking. One very interesting fact about him is that on April 26th, 2007, he actually became the first quadriplegic to experience zero gravity. He went on a private flight, and it's really, I think, a fitting illustration of his fight against his limitations. Because essentially, in ascending to space, at least for a limited amount of time, he was able to free himself of the restrictions on movement that his disease had imposed on him. And imagine how that must have felt for a person who was debilitated physically in the way he had been for the previous 40 plus years. Now, of course, most people with ALS do not live as long as Stephen Hawking. Stephen Hawking's case is the longest on record. However, there's still a possibility. And what's remarkable is, for the longest case of survival with ALS on record, we also have, I would say with near certainty, the most accomplished person with ALS on record. I would, of course, make no predictions about how Mr. Clendenin's disease would progress. However, I think that if he took a different attitude and remained determined to both enjoy life as much as he was able to and accomplish as much as he is able to while he can, using whatever faculties available to him, and to use technology and medical science to the extent possible to improve his chances and improve his functionality, then he would lead a much more fulfilling life. And while this disease is a terrible struggle for anyone, and certainly has been for Stephen Hawking, there could still be a lot of meaning and a lot of satisfaction and a lot of progress that a person in that position could make. The second article I would like to discuss draws on both Clendenin's essay and the Nuland Callahan paper. This article is also from the New York Times. It's called Death and Budgets by David Brooks. David Brooks starts with summarizing and recommending some of Clendenin's points, and he says after that, quote, "Clendenin's article is worth reading for the way he defines what life is. Life is not just breathing and existing in a self-enclosed skin bag. It's doing the activities with others you were put on earth to do." Now, I think in that mindset, Brooks displays an implicit fallacy, and that is that what you're choosing at any point of time is the whole of life, and what the whole of your life is to be like. And a lot of people from that misperception draw the idea that if you have terrible experiences, negative experiences, pain and suffering and paralysis and deterioration, that somehow detracts from the value of your life. It's like you can have periods of positive value where you are fulfilled, you do activities that, in Brooks's words, you were put on earth to do, and then you can also have negative periods where, because of a poor quality of life, having been alive for those periods is worse than not having been alive for those periods. And I emphatically disagree with that mentality. I believe that there is no negative value from living more. And the reason why is because at any given point in time, one cannot change the past. One can only affect the future. So what we're dealing with is not totalities, but rather marginal increments. From the standpoint of today, all we have control over are our lives from this point on. And marginal thinking in this way is a great alternative to this flawed totalistic thinking. And in terms of marginal thinking, in the future you can have something or you can have nothing. What you have in the future cannot change and cannot affect what has already happened to you in the past. So all the good things that you've done in your life and experienced in your life will always stay with you, as will the memories of those things, provided that your brain continues to be able to hold those memories. Any subsequent increment of your life may involve pleasure or may involve suffering, but its value added to your life is never negative. It can be positive, or it can be so infinitesimally small as to approach zero. But the ultimate zero is death. It's not existing at all. That cuts off your possibilities for any satisfaction, any attainment of values. Nothing that happens to you from this point on, as long as you do not commit acts of immorality toward other people, makes you a worse human being. If an individual is ravaged by disease, or experiences a debilitating accident, or finds himself in another situation of suffering or deprivation of opportunity, this is not something that fundamentally makes that person's life not worth living. It could be a very undesirable circumstance, something that ought to be remedied if possible, and at the very least struggled against, resisted, but it's not a license to reject life. Brooks, in his article, tries to link the current budget mess to, quote, our inability to face death, our willingness to spend our nation into bankruptcy to extend life for a few more sickly months. And I think that's a fallacious linkage, because our willingness to extend life is not the problem, even if we take the budget argument on its own terms. The problem is the federal government is spending too much money on healthcare. And of course that raises the question, why in the world is the federal government involved in healthcare in the first place? Healthcare is a service that can be provided on the free market and can be provided directly between two parties, the doctor and the patient. The involvement of third parties, particularly the federal government, is in most cases detrimental. And I've had previous videos and essays on this subject. Suffice it to say, if you follow a free market philosophy and a system of economics that is compatible with that philosophy, anything from the Austrian school to the Chicago school and many thinkers of classical economics, you will see that there's an alternative to vast government spending on healthcare. That alternative is private individuals choosing how to spend their money and possibly choosing to spend it on healthcare, including to extend their own lives. If we had a situation where the federal government was completely neutral in regard to healthcare, it didn't subsidize it, it didn't regulate it, there were just individual choices on a free market, then we wouldn't have a budget problem that had anything to do with healthcare. Of course, that's not the situation today. But if we want to solve our budget mess, it may be desirable to get the federal government out of healthcare. It would not be desirable to try to change people's healthcare priorities just in order to make the current federal intervention in some manner more sustainable. Of course, as I discuss in my critique of the Nuland-Callahan paper, the system won't be made more sustainable. It will be made less sustainable by the recommendations of Nuland and Callahan to cut off technological progress, which is the only force that has the potential to seriously drive down costs in the long term. And then Brooks talks about certain illusions that, quote, we have. The illusion that in spending so much on healthcare we are radically improving the quality of our lives. The illusion that through advances in medical research we are in the process of eradicating deadly diseases. And the barely suppressed hope that someday all of this spending and innovation will produce something close to immortality. Well, first of all, why is he calling these illusions when in fact considerable progress has been made to improve human life expectancy and to eradicate certain diseases and to develop treatments for others? And I'm not just talking about recent history, of course. I'm talking about a much broader picture. Since the start of the Industrial Revolution, this kind of progress has been ongoing and systematic. Of course, by no means inevitable, especially if commentators like Brooks and Nuland and Callahan and others like Leon Kass have their way in reducing the rate of this innovation. But why is he calling this an illusion? He's relying on the same fallacious arguments from Callahan and Nuland. In the next paragraph, he says, as Daniel Callahan and Sherwin B. Nuland point out in an essay in the New Republic called The Quagmire, our healthcare spending and innovation are not leading us toward a limitless extension of a good life. And again, this shows how problematic the Nuland-Callahan paper is. Their gloom and doom prognoses are being echoed, and they're being used as essentially a a call to resignation in the war against death. And that's despite the dubious basis of their essay, the very selective quoting of facts that they've employed, the dismissive attitude that they've taken toward very real medical progress that has happened recently, as well as their woeful lack of understanding of even elementary economics. But again, I needn't refute their fallacies here a second time, as I've already done that in Running from Death number 9. Brooks also mentions S.J. Olshansky, quote, one of the leading experts on aging, who, quote, argues that life expectancy is now leveling off. Olshansky has had previous discussions with advocates of indefinite life extension like Aubrey de Grey and Reason at the Longevity Meme and Fight Aging websites. And Olshansky has tried to argue that he is not attempting to influence public opinion in this kind of anti-life extension manner. However, it seems like the way he is being quoted consistently throughout the media, and of course the way he comes across in his own popular writing, his editorials that try to argue against approaches like SENS, strategies for engineered negligible senescence, he comes across as someone who discourages the fight against death by arguing essentially that the obstacles are too great. And at the very least, he ought to reconsider the desirability of how he's being portrayed and try to actively correct that portrayal in the media, because right now Olshansky's writing is being used as ammunition by the pro-mortality side, including Nuland and Callahan and now Brooks. Brooks continues to write that, quote, the fiscal implications are all around. A large share of our healthcare spending is devoted to ill patients in the last phases of life. Now I want to focus on this phrase, our healthcare spending. Whose healthcare spending? Is it the federal government's healthcare spending, or is it the healthcare spending of private individuals? I think the answer to that question matters tremendously, because if we were to take a situation where private individuals are the ones doing the spending to extend their own lives, or their relatives or their friends' lives, or the lives of others who perhaps couldn't afford it themselves out of charity through voluntary non-profit organizations, or for instance if they're doctors by working at hospitals that sometimes take patients out of charity, it would be very difficult even for someone like Brooks to oppose the decisions of those individuals to extend their lives. After all, they would be doing that with their own money, their own resources, their own will to achieve that purpose, and they wouldn't be coercing anyone else. They wouldn't be using an instrument like the federal government that takes money from some and gives it to others or uses it on others without necessarily the consent of the people from whom that money is taken. It's very important to analyze whose healthcare spending this is. If it's federal healthcare spending, then some cuts may be warranted, as long as those cuts are performed in a judicious and systematic fashion that doesn't endanger the lives of individuals who, because of the flaws of our system, have been inevitably led to depend on the federal government, as many senior citizens on Medicare unfortunately are. It's not their fault. And if you cut certain benefits from them, from the Medicare program, without enabling a viable private free market alternative system to emerge, many of those people will be imperiled. Brooks is not suggesting the same sort of active socialistic rationing program that Nuland and Callahan have in mind, and I'll give him credit for that. Both he and the next author I will discuss are more conservative in their politics, and while I disagree with them on quite a bit, it seems that one virtue of the American conservatives today is a significant aversion to cutting off life support, cutting off medical care coercively from people. And I think Brooks at least shares in that fundamental aversion. So what he's saying is, obviously we are never going to cut off Alzheimer's patients and leave them out on a hillside. We are never coercively going to give up on the old and ailing. So no forced euthanasia programs, no draconian rationing programs, at least that's good. Then he says, though, but it is hard to see us reducing healthcare inflation seriously unless people and their families are willing to do what Clendenin is doing, confront death and their obligations to the living. This is a very euphemistic way of putting the sentiment that people ought to voluntarily accept shorter lifespans in certain situations, such as Clendenin's, where they have a debilitating disease that could potentially be very expensive, and they shouldn't try to lengthen their lives too much if it creates too much much inconvenience and financial cost and similar kinds of expenditures. I disagree with that. For the reasons I emphasized above, a diagnosis like this, while it is certainly terrible and frightening and should be, is not the end. And it is not the end of opportunities to experience some sort of added value in one's life. And of course, from an individualist perspective, every individual is a universe unto himself. Every individual's mind is so rich in terms of experiences, in terms of knowledge, in terms of ideas about the world, in terms of a wide variety of capacities, that whenever a human being dies, an entire universe is extinguished. And that's not just a universe of all of those faculties that I mentioned, but also one of vantage point, or what I call I-ness. That individual's conscious awareness of the world comes from a perspective that will never again be repeated. And to counsel these people to even voluntarily snuff out those universes is, I believe, highly detrimental. Of course, I wouldn't deny anyone the right to choose to do what Clendenin is doing, but I find it deeply regrettable. And if he were my friend, I would try to dissuade him from taking any active steps to end his life. Brooks ends his article by referring to several essays by other prominent pro-mortality writers, including in particular Leon Cass, who in both his writing and his work on George W. Bush's President's Council on Bioethics has done some terrible, terrible damage to medical progress in the name of attempting to essentially limit human potential. Leon Cass, I think, is one of the great villains, if we can call them that, in this great struggle between those who want to extend human life and those who believe that human beings should artificially impose limits on their lifespans, even though there's nothing in the laws of nature that imposes an impregnable upper bound on how long creatures may live. If we have tortoises that can live for 200 plus years and nuts and nests, if we have a creature like Turritopsis nutricula, which can achieve functional immortality, then why in the world should human beings accept a lifespan of a certain finite duration simply because it's statistically common for the particular era we happen to live in, even though it would have been fantastically long in the Paleolithic period or even in the Middle Ages? Brooks concludes his article by saying that, in large measure, the budget mess is about our inability to face death and our willingness as a nation to spend whatever it takes to push it just slightly over the horizon. I will contend that to solve the current budget mess, we don't even need to think about this issue. There are very easy ways to eliminate the budget deficit and start rapidly reducing the U.S. national debt. One, end all of those disastrous military occupations that the U.S. is engaged in. Withdraw from Iraq immediately. Withdraw from Afghanistan immediately. End the bombing campaign in Libya. Withdraw American troops from tens of other overseas military bases where American military presence is completely superfluous and a drain on the federal budget, and you will see massive savings. End the atrocious war on drugs at home, whereby millions of people are imprisoned just for consuming substances that may not be good for them, where thousands and tens of thousands of innocent people, even people who have never used drugs, have their homes raided in a brutal style, have their property demolished, have their pets killed or themselves killed because of the brutal militarization of police that has been occurring in this country since the start of the drug war. End the foreign interventions on the drug war, and you will already see massive budget savings. And then it would be time to start cutting entitlement programs. Allow for individuals to opt out of Social Security and create a transitional mechanism that would phase out that program. Likewise for Medicare, it may take a few decades, but eventually it would be possible to get rid of these enormous unfunded liabilities without individuals changing what they value about their lives and prolonging their lives. The third article I would like to discuss is a commentary by Peter Lawler called David Brooks on Our Unaffordable War Against Death. And Lawler, I think, also takes what one might call a conservative perspective on this issue. In some ways, it's a perspective that I respect more than the Nuland Callahan perspective, particularly because it relies much less on coercion and central planning. And Lawler does, in his second paragraph, state, "Let me begin by being clear that I'm not for euthanizing or rationing people to death, and I don't think David is either. His example is of a man who freely chooses not to employ extreme means for life prolongation." So, to be fair to Brooks and Lawler, I agree. I don't think they believe that coercion is the way that would be most desirable for them. They want a kind of voluntary renunciation. In their minds, a recognition of the finitude of life, and instead of attempting to prolong it always, to essentially gracefully accept its end. I completely disagree with the ethics involved here, but what I would like to do is to go into some of the philosophical statements that Lawler makes, because of the three articles that I am discussing today, his is the most philosophical. He says, "Modern technology, our great Lockean Cartesian project, is a war against nature and for personal significance, and so, among other things, a war against the personal extinction that we often believe comes with death." So far, so good. I think this is a good war. The alternative to it is dreadful. It's a fatalistic resignation to one's own elimination. An individual cannot truly, completely step outside his own perspective or vantage point or I-ness. It's true that we can empathize with other people. We can imagine what it would be like to be another person, what it would be like to have certain experiences that we are not having. However, all the while we are doing that, we remain ourselves. We remain our physical organisms and our physical minds. And we literally cannot step outside ourselves, disembody ourselves, because ourselves are our bodies and our minds. We are each one individual organism with this unique, unrepeatable vantage point. So this war that Lawler refers to is essentially a defensive struggle, a struggle to preserve that unique individual vantage point. He calls it a war against nature. And in one sense it is. Nature is very cruel. Nature is very destructive. Think back to all of the terrible natural disasters that have occurred even thus far this year. The massive earthquakes, tsunamis, tornadoes, heat waves, wildfires, floods throughout the world. What does that tell us about nature and what it does to living creatures? Certainly just because something is natural does not mean that it is good or desirable or even acceptable. Nature also contains parasites, deadly and disgusting diseases, rather arbitrary limitations on resources in certain cases, as with famines and droughts. Are those to be accepted just because they're natural? Our own bodies, our own human anatomy, are terribly flawed and irrational in many respects. This is one of the greatest arguments against the existence of a God and against intelligent design, because if a God had existed, his designs would be quite unintelligent. No competent engineer would design the human body the way it is, with all of its suboptimalities, with all of its vulnerabilities, the gross inefficiencies that are involved therein, and the superfluous elements that in many respects can only hurt us. Think about the appendix as an example. If there were design in this universe by some person-like being, it could hardly be called intelligent. So there is nothing wrong with fighting a war against the bad aspects of nature. Nature, of course, is such a generic term. In most ways that it's used, it's everything except human beings, which I think is a rather flawed and self-deprecating perspective. A better usage might be everything that exists is natural, in which case, yes, there are some aspects of nature that we're at war against, others we're fine with. And there is nothing wrong with personal significance either. Lawler attempts to argue that the struggle against death leads to a reluctance to reproduce. He says that we don't really need kids after all if we're staying around indefinitely. I would argue that's not necessarily so. Again, it depends on human personal goals. If an individual wants to raise another human being, if that individual believes that there's value in that experience, then irrespective of the longevity of the parent, that person might want to have children. There might be a statistical decline in population growth, but that has already been happening. It has been happening because of increased technological progress in other respects. The movement away from an agricultural paradigm where having a lot of kids means having a lot of help on the farm, toward a more technological, service-based paradigm where the extensive education required to function in the economy means that kids don't become capable of self-sufficiency in an economic sense until they are much older than they would need to be to work on the farm. It's true that population growth rates are declining throughout the world, but this is not to say that the war against death is going to fuel that decline. In many ways, it may be the only thing that averts an undesirable decline in the human population. For a more thorough discussion on that, please see my fourth video in the Eliminating Death series, where I refute the overpopulation argument. Lawler continues by saying, "It could surely be better for each of us if we could become more accepting when it comes to death, and so not deploy every high-tech weapon available in every case." And I disagree here, because again, death for an individual is like a universe extinguished. So, given the magnitude of what is at stake and what could be lost, of course every high-tech weapon should be deployed. If there's any good reason to spend money on something, this is it. And of course, as these technologies are used more and more extensively, and as researchers and technicians and doctors and engineers work on adapting these technologies to more human use, the costs will go down, as I described in Running from Death number 9. Lawler says, "The ancient learning how to die in the absence of personal salvation by a personal creator is about coming to terms with the inevitable. But the successes of modern science have cast into doubt that conclusion that death is inevitable any particular time. Death seems less a necessity to be accepted with courage and serenity, and more an accident to be avoided through incessant effort." Well, first of all, death is an accident. If death occurs, or if disease occurs, or if injury occurs, it means something has broken down. Something has malfunctioned in the system that is the human organism. There's no greater purpose to it. There's no higher way in which it is somehow desirable. It's in some ways as mundane and pointless as a car breaking down, or a computer breaking down, except with a living organism, if it's broken down completely, you can't just restart it or restore the same process with different parts. Of course, as medical technology progresses, it may be possible to rescue certain human systems that today would be considered past the point of saving. But really what Lawler does is he contrasts the ancient tragic view of life as essentially an inevitable decline to be confronted gracefully and with serenity, perhaps accepted rather than confronted would be an even more accurate characterization, with the scientific view, which is that we can fight against death and at least win victories some of the time. I find the scientific view much more preferable. And beyond even calling it the scientific view, one can call it the Enlightenment view or the modern view. The idea that we can emerge out of the darkness and barbarism and woeful, pathetic limitations that have characterized us during most of our history, and that we can aspire to something better. The tragic view is by definition tragic. It's very sad. It's not the model of a paradigm that one should willingly accept. For the ancients, perhaps, they saw no other way, because their technology was so woefully limited, and they hadn't yet developed an understanding of economic systems that could noticeably improve technology during their lifetimes. So, for instance, the Stoic school of philosophers felt like the only recourse available to them is how they react toward the inevitable. But we live in a more hopeful time. Lawler refers to, quote, the wisdom of St. Augustine. What's a couple more years or decades or centuries in the light of eternity? And I think that shows a failure to identify what the appropriate perspective is. I think it's very problematic when people say, well, the universe is so vast, and there are billions of stars in each galaxy, and there are billions of galaxies, and we are just so tiny and puny and insignificant on a cosmic scale. True, there are billions of stars and billions of galaxies, but that doesn't say anything about the significance of an individual human organism. Because the scale that matters, the perspective that matters, are the ones in which we operate. The human scale is the one with which we interact on a daily, moment-by-moment basis. Once again, we cannot step fully outside of our vantage point. And while we can recognize the vastness of the universe, all that should say to a rational human being who values his life is, look at how much there is out there to try to learn and explore and understand and use for improving life. Ultimately, everything, knowledge, experience, action, relates to the entity that is undertaking them, to the human being. To say that just because we know that something is vast in terms of time or space, this somehow diminishes us, I think is deeply fallacious. The vastness should only encourage us to explore further and give us an understanding that we need more time, we need more resources, we need more opportunities, and we need to struggle to obtain time, resources, and opportunities opportunities that do not already come readily to us. Lawler continues by saying, and to the extent that we're Lockeans, or as Walker Percy says, pop Cartesians, we tend to identify the end of one's own self-consciousness with the extinction of being itself. So the war against my death has extreme cosmic significance. I'm the one who endows meaning and purpose on existence. Nothing is more important than keeping me alive, especially as the singularity approaches. Our transhumanists promise that we will morph from being biological beings stuck with vulnerable and decaying bodies into conscious robots with readily replaceable parts. We hope to take control away from nature and put it in our own hands. We hope we're replacing cruel and random from a personal view impersonal evolution with a conscious and volitional or highly personal evolution. I might question some of his word choice there, but what's so bad about that? What is wrong with attempting to essentially take control of our own destinies away from a process of evolution that has resulted in 99.9% of all species that ever existed being extinct? That's not individual organisms, that's species. Within each species, the vast majority of individual organisms dying completely cruel, disgusting deaths, only to achieve a little bit of natural selection over time frames of thousands of generations and millions of years. Replace that with a kind of evolution that is humane, that is faster, that responds to the needs of individual organisms, and allows these wonderful universes inside each one of us to be preserved and to develop and to flourish. What's so bad about that? Especially considering that the alternative is this tragic view of resignation and self-limitation. Lawler says of Brooks that Brooks is concluding that obsessing over one's own being is both unnatural and contrary to the happiness we social beings are given by nature. What happiness are we given? Once again, nature on its own terms can be very cruel. If any of us were born into the Paleolithic era, there would not be happiness, there would be constant drudgery. There would be a life that Hobbes described as nasty, brutish, and short. The happiness that we have is almost entirely due to human effort and to the accomplishments of civilization by which we are able to enjoy technology and infrastructure and culture that elevate us from the kind of misery and drudgery we would have had to experience if we only faced nature as it was in the Paleolithic era. We are not given anything. We have had to earn almost everything that allows us to experience any kind of happiness. Lawler continues by stating that Brooks says quite nobly that we should think of our lives in terms of doing what we're put here to do, not in terms of merely fending off the destruction nature intends for each of us. Now, I'm not entirely sure who puts people, quote, here to do anything. As I'm an atheist and an advocate of reason and rational choice, I believe that individuals choose what they ought to do, and each individual, in a significant way, defines the story of his life. That being said, the essence of Brooks's attitude doesn't need to conflict with the desire for human life extension. Indeed, the two can be combined in the same project. One's purpose could be to fight against death, to fend off its various manifestations. I think in many ways the project of civilization is precisely this, finding ways to win at least little victories against death and deterioration and decay, and to elevate the human condition. There doesn't need to be a conflict there. And second, it is not unnatural, in some perverse connotation, to struggle for survival. Most creatures struggle for survival. The chances they're given in nature as unmodified by man are miserable, but most creatures try to keep on living, even if it's just by instinct. Only certain human beings, and perhaps praying mantises and black widow spiders and certain insects that destroy themselves upon reproducing, can renounce their own survival. I would not be fond of being placed in the company of black widows and praying mantises. So, with the rational faculty that I have, it gives me a better chance than most of the animals have. I will choose my survival. Lawler says that our techno-war against personal death has already been at the expense of the happiness we're meant to enjoy as social animals. No, why? Why should it be at the expense of happiness to try to live longer, and if a large part of our lives is interacting with other people, giving other people the benefit of our existence longer? Who wants to lose a loved one or a friend? Why should that ever be considered a good thing? Why should losing a loved one or a friend ever be considered a net contribution to happiness? Lawler says that, quote, our self-obsession has been hard on families, children, friends, citizens, and creatures. I dispute this because if indeed human beings do share these bonds with one another that Lawler praises, they would not want one another to perish needlessly. They would, in caring for one another, wish each other the longest lives possible, and not just wish it, act for it, and encourage actions to be taken to prolong life. For someone like Dudley Clendinen, the best thing any friend or relative of his could do is to persuade him to try to hold on to his life as long as he can, and enable his friends and family to have the benefit of him staying around for even a little longer. Lawler concludes by saying that our mistake must be in believing that our personal existence is dependent on what we can do for ourselves. And my answer to him is, yes, it is. It is dependent on what we can do for ourselves. Look at progress. Look at technological progress. Look at moral and cultural progress. Look at the great accomplishments of art, music, architecture, science, medicine. Many of these accomplishments were the work of single individuals who did hold the mindset that their existence as human beings depended on what they could do for themselves and as themselves. We remember these individuals as great innovators who have contributed enormously to our own standards of living, who are the difference between where we are today and the era of the cavemen. And I say we should continue to believe that what happens to us is dependent on what we can do for ourselves and as ourselves as rational, freely thinking, volitional agents. This is why we should continue to fight against death and decay no matter how difficult the obstacles would seem to be. Fortunately, we live in a time when there is great hope as well, and that hope should not be extinguished by people like Brooks and Lawler and Nuland and Callahan. If they do not want to choose personal life extension for themselves, that would be unfortunate in my view, but they have that freedom. However, what they most emphatically should not do is discourage the rest of us from pursuing that most worthwhile path.